Again, it's so good to be back with you this afternoon. I realize now as I stand up here that I may not see some of you until 2016. We have a group from the youth, for one, that will be going off to Exposure. And I'm a little bit jealous of you. Exposure, that's just wonderful memories, as we talked about memories a little bit this morning. A wonderful thing y'all are going to be a part of, and we pray your blessings there. Again, if you're traveling today, we want to pray blessings on you and your traveling. And thank you so much for being with us here today. We did talk about the family a little bit this morning, and we're going to continue kind of in that vein this afternoon. You know, for one, Scripture is just full of blessings and wisdom and knowledge that we just couldn't quite fully grasp if we didn't have the family. I believe that God created the family in part to teach us about Himself. And there are so many things, so many passages that we could point to where God said, you know, it's just like this in your family. It's just like that father-son relationship. It's just like that husband-wife relationship. It's just like being brothers and sisters. And you know, the Bible, God just uses the family over and over and over again. I think that's part of the reason He created the family, was to explain Himself to us. One in particular that I love, Deuteronomy chapter 1, verses 30 through 31. This is just a beautiful picture. The Lord your God goes before you. Who goes before you? Himself will fight for you, just as He did for you in Egypt before your eyes, and in the wilderness, where you have seen how the Lord your God carried you as a man carries his son, all the way that you went until you came to this place. Isn't that a beautiful image? The Lord your God, He carried you, and it's just like a father carrying his son. That's just what God did for you. And over again, God does this in His Bible, teaches us about who He is and who we are. And we've got some good fathers and some good mothers in this room, in this church right now, who you carry your families, you carry your children, and this church is better for it. This church is better because we have parents like that here, and I want to thank you for that. Thank you for what you do. That is the utmost, highest work that you will do in your walk here on this earth, carrying that family and being there for your family. We're going to talk about a father and a mother this afternoon. It's in Hebrews chapter 11 and verse 23, as was just read. I want to read it one more time. By faith, Moses, when he was born, was hidden for 3 months by his parents, because they saw that the child was beautiful, and they were not afraid of the king's edict. Now, the text begins by faith, Moses, but as we read it, we realize we're not talking about Moses' faith right here. We're talking about the faith of two individuals named Amram and Jochebed, his parents. They're not named here in this text. Actually, if you go to Exodus chapter 2, where we're going to take this epitome that we're talking about here in Hebrews, they're not even named there. It's just Moses' parents. You got to go to genealogical texts like Exodus chapter 6, Numbers chapter 26, and that's where we find their names, Amram and Jochebed. We learn that they are of the first generation to be born in Egypt. They are grandsons of Levi, and the text actually tells us that Levi's children were born before they came down into Egypt. And so we're looking at the first generation to actually be born in Egypt. It's kind of strange, you know, the way my mind works. I think, you know, when the brothers of Joseph, the sons of Jacob, keep going down to Egypt to get more grain, and they go back and they're answering to their dad, and their dad is telling them what to do. And just, in my mind, I just picture these teenagers, maybe 20-year-olds, that threw Joseph in the pit. But when you get into the text a little bit, Joseph was 39 years old when they came down to Egypt, and he was the second youngest. So we're talking about 50, 60, 70-year-old men by that point in time. Levi already has his sons. Amram is one of his grandsons who is born there in the land of Egypt. It's a compound word, Amram is. Am means nation. Am means nation, and Ram means exalted or high or lifted up. Amram's name literally means exalted nation. Jochebed, she also has a compound name. That first part, you see it in a lot of Israelites' names, Jah or Yah. It goes back to Yahweh or Jehovah, the Lord. Jochebed, Kebed, it means, it's a word that's kind of strange in our language. It means weighty or weight. But you kind of have to understand the way that the Hebrews used this concept of weight. Sometimes weight meant punishment, as in though the Lord's hand is heavy upon us. It could mean punishment. Sometimes, most times, and I believe in this name anyway, it means glory. as though it is so weighty with riches. And you weight it down even more because you heap praises upon it and you heap glory upon it. Jochebed's name, therefore, means the Lord is my glory, or the Lord is my weight. But really, we would say, the Lord is my glory. And so, how fitting is that? Exalted nation, and the Lord is my glory. Parents of this man who would exalt the nation of Israel. It would be used by God to exalt the nation of Israel. And who would again bring the glory of the Lord into the midst of Israel. These things that Moses would do. But as we come to them, at this time that we first see them, Exodus chapter 2, and you can go ahead and turn over there. We're going to be reading a little bit from that passage. In Exodus chapter 2, things are anything but, right? They're not an exalted nation, the Israelites. They are actually being oppressed very terribly. Exodus 2 and verse 14, he made their lives bitter with hard service. Pharaoh, this generation arose which knew not Joseph, knew not what Joseph and his family had done for this country. And he issues this decree that all the boys be thrown into the river, the girls they can live. We know this story, the things that were going on when Moses came into this world. You know, Genesis chapter 47, it tells us how Joseph just enriched the country of Egypt. And it's insane to me how quickly a nation can change. As this new Pharaoh who knew not Joseph is having the Israelites build these cities of Pithom and Ramses, doing these big building projects on the backs of the Israelites, he's using money that Joseph raised in order to pay for it. And Joseph had enriched Pharaoh. 1/5 of all the income of the Egyptians went to Pharaoh's household, and that's on top of all the money that had come in from other nations who had come down there to buy grain. And so the Israelites enriched Pharaoh, and now Pharaoh has turned on them, and this idea of exalted nation and the Lord is my glory, we see these in the names of Moses' parents, but that is not the situation that we see as they are living there. Exodus chapter 2, verse 1 through 2, the Hebrew writer looks over the entire lives of these two people, and here's the epitome of their faith. How faithful were they? What did they do that showed us that they had great faith? Here we go. Exodus chapter 2, verse 1 through 2. Now a man from the house of Levi went and took as his wife a Levite woman. The woman conceived and bore a son, and when she saw that he was a fine child, she hid him 3 months. That's what the Hebrew writer is talking about. Now, the rest of the story is fascinating. We know the rest of the story, how Jochebed refused, and doing so, she put Moses in that basket full of reeds, and she floated him down the river. And we know how his sister watched from the river bank and saw the daughter of Pharaoh reach down and pick him up and take him as her own. And we know that she named him Moses, which means drawn out. I think that's very interesting, by the way. When other nations took over the Israelites, sometimes they would change their names around to fit better with their way of thinking. When Daniel and his friends were taken over by the Babylonians, what did they do? They changed their names. You're not Daniel, you're Belteshazzar. You're Shadrach, you're Meshach, you're Abednego. They gave them Babylonian names. Pharaoh's daughter doesn't do that. She picks him up out of the river and says, I'm going to name you Moses, which means drawn out, and that's a Hebrew name. She lets him keep his culture, so to speak, and she names him drawn out, so prophetic of when he will draw the people out of Egypt later on in his life. But that's all kind of later. All the Hebrew writer wants to tell us about is they hid him. Back to Hebrews 11, verse 23, how faithful were they? They were not afraid of the king's edict, and so they hid their child. It says they hid their child because he was beautiful. I want to clarify something real quick because this kind of sounds a little off. They hid him because he was beautiful. How terrible to think that, well, if he wasn't beautiful, they wouldn't have hid him. They might have gone through with Pharaoh's commands if it wasn't such a good-looking child, but that's not what the text is really saying. This word here for beautiful, it's a rare word. It's only used twice in the entire New Testament, and both times it's referring to baby Moses, both times. The other time being Acts 7 and verse 20. It's a word that just tries to mirror what the Hebrew word is doing in the Exodus text, and that word can mean other things. It can mean good, it can mean honorable, it can mean well-pleasing. And actually, when you go to that Acts 7 text, I think Stephen really has more of the meaning in the New Testament there. He says, at this time Moses was born, and he was beautiful in God's sight. He was beautiful in God's sight, and he was brought up for 3 months in his father's house. Stephen, by the Holy Spirit, he adds that little phrase that kind of gives us a better idea. It wasn't just that he was good looking, he was well-pleasing in God's sight. And that became the motivation for what Amram and Jochebed did. By faith, they saw that he was well-pleasing to God, and they did not obey the king's edict. I want to stop right there and just say this, that faithful parenting begins here. It begins by seeing, remember what we're talking about in our Hero series, seeing as God sees and seeing God in the situation. It begins by seeing your children as God sees them, seeing the beauty that God sees. The human eye distorts beauty, and so much so with our children. It begins even in our children. What is good and what is honorable and what is pleasing? Well, the world wants to say if you're good looking or if you're pretty or if you're skinny, that means you're valuable. If you're athletic, if you can throw a baseball, if you can throw a football, that means you're valuable. If you're smart, if you make straight A's, if you're going to a really well-to-do college and getting a really high-level degree, that means that you're valuable. And that's the kind of lines that the world tries to spin on us. And no, good parenting starts here by seeing the beauty the way that God sees beauty. And it's hard enough to keep that garbage from getting to our children because the television, the internet, all these outside sources are pumping it into their brains. So oftentimes, though, that's not where they get it. So oftentimes they get it from us. It's hard for us not to think that way. We've got to work hard to teach them what true beauty is and to understand what true beauty is for ourselves. And so God would have us know, children, God would have you to know that you are beautiful before you make the first A. Before somebody tells you you're pretty, before you throw a football and the coach says you're on the team, you're beautiful to God. And that's where we must start. As Amram and Jochebed did, they saw the beauty that God saw. So what did they do? This is so funny to me. This is a little strange. By faith, they hid. It doesn't sound very faithful. By faith, they hid. And it adds even further onto that. By faith, they hid, and they weren't afraid either. They weren't afraid of the king's edict, so by faith, they hid. That sounds kind of backwards. Hiding and faith don't seem to go together. Hiding and not be afraid don't seem to go together. But that's what we learn about Amram and Jochebed. I've called them the heroes of fearless hiding because God says they weren't afraid, but they hid. Now, why is that the case? Why is hiding such an epitome of faith? Why is hiding described as being fearless in this case? I want to point out that in a couple of weeks we're going to talk about Rahab. And this is just one of many examples the Bible gives us of hiding because you do not fear, hiding because you're faithful. Remember, Rahab hid those spies because she did not fear her own people. She feared God, and she was faithful to God. David, you might remember, David was often on the run from Saul, and he was hiding from him. Why? Because he was faithful to God, and he would not kill the Lord's anointed. And so by faith, he hid. John chapter 7, verses 1 through 6, Jesus often hid because he was faithful and because he did not fear. After this, Jesus went into Galilee. He would not go into Judea because the Jews were seeking to kill him. Now the Jews' feast of booths was at hand, so his brothers said to him, "Leave here and go to Judea, that your disciples may also see the works you're doing. For no one works in secret if he seeks to be known openly. If you do these things, show yourself to the world, for not even his brothers believed in him." And Jesus said to them, "My time has not yet come, but your time is always here." There are times and places, even within fearless faith, when the most faithful thing that a child of God can do is to hide. And someone will say, "I'm not hiding, I'm not afraid of anything." Well, Jesus wasn't afraid of anything, and Jesus hid. Amram and Jochebed were not afraid, and yet Jochebed and Amram hid because it was God's will. Well, we need to see that sometimes hiding is within God's will. But on the other hand, we need to see that sometimes hiding is outside of God's will. What does it say in Matthew chapter 5, verses 14 through 16? "You're the light of the world. A city set on a hill cannot be hidden. Nor do people put a lamp and put it under a basket, but on a stand. And it gives light to all in the house. In the same way, let your light shine before others, so that they may see your good works and give glory to your Father who's in heaven." Jesus says, don't hide. You remember the time where Moses marched the Israelites right up to the promised land, and most of them didn't want to go in there. Why? Because there's giants in there. We can't go in there. They'll squash us. And God said, no, you're not supposed to hide. That's not faithful when you hide. Jesus, he's hidden before, but now Matthew chapter 16, he says, "I'm going to Jerusalem." And Peter says, "No, don't go to Jerusalem." And Jesus says, "Get behind me, Satan." It's not faithful to hide. There's times in the Bible where it's faithful to hide, and there's times in the Bible where it's not faithful to hide. And so how are we supposed to know the difference? Where do we draw the line? And I think as we put these on each side of the ledger here and try to find the difference, what we see is that there's times where God sees a confrontation coming, but it's not time yet. It's God's timing that we must wait for. And there's times in which God is at work still preparing the way for what will come, but the time is not yet. There will be a reckoning one day in broad daylight, but the time is not yet. And when Jesus hid, he hid and he said, "My time has not yet come." When David hid from Saul, remember that David was already anointed as the king of Israel. But he said, "I can't kill the king's anointed." God's going to have to take care of that in his own time. It's not time yet. So as we look at the faith of Amram and Jochebed, here's what we come to. Mom and Dad, there's a time when we got to hide our children. Now, they're going to have to stand before God by themselves. Ezekiel chapter 18 and verse 20, "The righteousness of the righteous shall be on himself, and the wickedness of the wicked shall be upon himself." They're going to have to stand before God without us. And there is a day and a time where they're going to have a confrontation. But as we're training them in our homes, we recognize that we must hide them from things as we get them ready for that day. You know, today, one of Satan's greatest tools, I believe, is this idea of privacy that extends into all areas in the home. Some kind of privacy that the parents, you're not supposed to cross that line. And the thing is, there are massive amounts of things that don't need to be in our children's brains that are coming through the television, massive amounts of things that are coming over the internet. And if we have some kind of unabated privacy policy in our home, how are we supposed to go up against that? If we don't have access to the battlefield on which that war is occurring, how are we supposed to go up against that? Remember back in Deuteronomy chapter 1, "The Lord your God who goes before you, he himself will fight for you." How are we supposed to fight if we don't even get onto the battlefield? We must go and we must carry our children spiritually, and that means that we must be able to hide them from some things that would come into their heads. You know that we were told when we were looking for a school in which to place our children, you know, your children are missionaries. And that's true in a sense. But I'll remind us of a couple of things. You know, Jesus ate with tax collectors and sinners, but you remember Jesus didn't take children with him into those places. You wouldn't put a MVP junior high running back into the Super Bowl. Why not? Well, he's not formed for that collision yet. He's learning how to make an impact in his arena, but you put him in too big of a contest there, and that's too much. It's the same way with spiritual growth and spiritual formation. Our children are missionaries in a sense, and they're growing and learning how to be impactful for God. But we must be mindful of the fact that they are still growing. They need guidance and they need protection as they grow. And they will have a day when they have that full-on confrontation with their pharaohs, whatever that happens to be, when God will use them to do great things. But let us make sure that as they grow, we go before them and we hide them from those things until they're ready for them. As I said, there will become a day for each and every one of us, children, adult, where we stand before our God and we answer for that choice that we have made. The righteousness of the righteous shall be on himself. The wickedness of the wickedness shall be on himself. Each person must stand there in that day. And so this afternoon, if that's just the decision that's put before you, if you this afternoon have come to that point where you are ready to become a child of God and you are not yet, I want to encourage you to come to him this afternoon for yourself. I want to encourage you to come to him because you want to stand before him in that day. And if you're not a child of God this afternoon, I want to encourage you to come. If you are a child of God and yet you've not been living like a child of God, if there's something in your life that you need to get out of the way, if you need to repent, if you need to come to him for any reason, if you just need strength and encouragement and prayers, please come while we stand and while we sing.